Welcome to the deep dive. We're really glad you're joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for tuning in.
So let's just set the scene right out of the gate here. It is March 6, 2026. And if you are managing agricultural land in Australia, particularly in New South Wales, the ground beneath your feet is, well, it's undergoing a seismic shift,
Right.
a huge shift.
We are talking about the most ambitious reform to federal environmental law in a quarter of a century, really.
And our mission for this deep dive today is to basically map out exactly what is happening. We are unpacking the monumental 2025 reforms to the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act.
Which most people just know as the EPBC Act.
Exactly, the EPBC Act.
Yeah.
But more importantly, we are translating what these sweeping federal changes actually mean on the ground for a New South Wales farm business.
Yeah, because that's where it hits home.
Right. So we'll cover how the EPBC is changing, how it reshapes your interactions with state agencies through bilateral agreements, and what your day-to-day land management is actually going to look like moving forward. And just to be completely clear up front, our goal today is not to take any kind of political stance on this.
No, not at all.
We are looking at a huge stack of recent legal guides, government memos, policy statements from all sides of this debate. And our job as your guides is just to impartially map out the facts.
Yeah, we just want to synthesize all this conflicting information so you can navigate this new reality with total confidence.
So let's start with the why. Why did this happen? This massive overhaul traces back to the Samuel Review, which was this independent review that delivered a pretty blunt assessment.
Very blunt.
Yeah, it basically found that the old EPDC Act was fundamentally ineffective. It was outdated, too complex, slow, and ultimately failing to protect biodiversity.
Which led to widespread distrust from basically everyone, the community, industry, you name it.
Right. So in response to that failure, the federal government passed a massive reform package in late 2025.
And this isn't just a tweak to the existing rules.
Yeah.
It is a complete structural rebuild. It's aimed at creating clearer rules, stronger compliance, and much more defensible decisions. It establishes an entirely new landscape for anyone making decisions about land use.
Which brings us to the new sheriff in town. On July 1st, 2026, the National Environmental Protection Agency, or NEPA, officially commences operations.
And NEPA is a truly independent regulator with some incredibly serious teeth.
Yeah, teeth is the right word. The CEO of NEPA is being granted extraordinarily broad powers, including the ability to issue what are called environment protection orders.
Which, in practical terms, are essentially stop work orders.
Right, and they can be issued in writing or in urgent circumstances. They can even do it verbally.
Wow. And what is critical for you to understand is how those orders are issued. The CEO doesn't even have to observe the natural justice hearing rule.
Wait, so what does that mean in plain English?
In plain English, that means if NEPA believes there is an imminent threat of serious damage to the environment, they do not have to give you a warning.
Or a chance to defend yourself.
Exactly. No chance to defend yourself before shutting your operation down. They can just issue a stop work order right there on the spot. They can also mandate directed environmental audits and an entirely new form of compliance audit.
And then there are the financial penalties. I mean, the numbers here are just genuinely staggering.
They really are.
The Samuel Review explicitly criticized the old system, where fines were so low they were often just factored into a project's budget as a basic cost of doing business.
Right, just a line item.
Exactly. But the new reforms introduce a formula that fundamentally changes the math. For individuals, fines can still be substantial, but for corporations, if the court can determine the financial benefit obtained from the breach, the penalty can be 3 times the value of that benefit.
Or alternatively, it can reach up to $825 million.
$825 million.
Yeah, that is not a slap on the wrist.
No, that is a sell the company and turn off the lights level of penalty.
And the sheer scale of that number is designed to ensure absolute compliance. It signals a major shift from treating environmental breaches as a regulatory nuisance to treating them as an existential threat to a business.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because it is not just about the enforcer, it is about the rules they are enforcing. And that brings us to the new National Environmental Standards, or NES.
Yes, the NES. These are legally binding, measurable standards for matters of national environmental significance.
And they represent a major philosophical shift in Australian environmental law, don't they?
They do. Under the old system, the goal was generally no net loss. You impact an area, you offset it somewhere else to balance the ledger.
Right.
But the new standards enshrine a strict hierarchy. avoid, mitigate, repair, and finally offset. And they introduced the highly debated net gain test.
The net gain test. So the shift from no net loss to net gain changes the entire trajectory of project approvals.
Absolutely. If a proposed action has what the legislation calls a residual significant impact, meaning an impact on protected matters that cannot be entirely avoided, mitigated, or repaired on-site, the proponent must pass this net gain test to get approval.
And how do you pass that?
You can achieve this by either delivering traditional land-based offsets or by paying a restoration contribution charge into a newly created restoration contribution special account.
And that special account is a fascinating mechanism. It'll be managed by an independent holder to fund specific conservation and regeneration initiatives.
Right. It basically provides an alternative pathway for proponents who can't physically source the necessary land-based offsets themselves.
I also want to touch on something that was debated fiercely during the legislative process, but was ultimately left out of the final package. There is no climate trigger in these reforms.
That's a huge point.
Yeah, a climate trigger would have meant that emissions-intensive activities automatically required federal environmental assessment based solely on their greenhouse gas output.
But the government opted not to include that trigger, leaving climate policy primarily to the safeguard mechanism. However, proponents are now subjected to mandatory reporting of their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions.
So Scope 1 being direct emissions from owned or controlled sources.
Correct. And Scope 2 being indirect emissions from the generation of purchased energy.
So even without a climate trigger formally stopping your project, your emissions data is now public. This is a massive shift. It opens companies up to public pressure, investor scrutiny, and potentially future regulations.
It acts as a backdoor way of enforcing climate accountability, ensuring that emissions disclosure is a mandatory part of the informational landscape.
So we have this massive federal framework coming into play, but if you are sitting on a farm in regional New South Wales, the obvious question is, how does a sweeping federal law actually touch down in your paddocks?
Right. How do you avoid drowning in double paperwork, dealing with Sydney on one hand and Canberra on the other?
Exactly. Well, the Commonwealth and New South Wales utilize what is called an assessment bilateral agreement. I like to think of New South Wales as the investigator gathering the facts and Canberra as the judge making the final call.
That's a great analogy. Under an assessment bilateral agreement, the New South Wales government steps in to assess the environmental impacts of a proposed project on behalf of the federal government.
So imagine you want to build a major new irrigation infrastructure project.
Right. Without this agreement, you would have to prepare two entirely separate environmental impact statements, hire two sets of consultants, and navigate two completely separate bureaucracies.
Which sounds like a nightmare.
It is. But with the agreement, New South Wales does the legwork, applies the rigorous federal standards, and prepares a single assessment report. However, the Commonwealth Minister still retains the final power to decide whether the project is actually approved under the EPBC Act.
And this mechanism has a proven track record. Since 2015, New South Wales and the Australian government have avoided duplicated work on billions of dollars in proposed investment. Right now, this agreement is undergoing a crucial operational update
to align with the new EPBC rules. And what's fascinating here is the underlying strategy of the New South Wales government. Minister Penny Sharp and her department are actively upgrading state laws, like the Biodiversity Conservation Act and the Planning System Reforms Act, to match these new federal standards.
It's a very deliberate dual strategy, isn't it?
It really is. New South Wales wants to maintain state control over land management. They want state agencies to remain the primary regulators you interact with.
Because if their state laws don't satisfy the new federal standards, the Commonwealth, and that powerful new NEPA regulator we just talked about, will simply step in and regulate the state directly.
Exactly. And no state government wants federal agents from Canberra handling local land clearing disputes in regional New South Wales.
Definitely not. So by upgrading their own biodiversity offset scheme and planning laws to mirror the federal standards, New South Wales is ensuring that their state processes will keep the federal regulators at bay.
So what does this all mean for the actual farm business? Let's bring it right down to the dirt. If you want to clear some vegetation or change your land use, you will not, in the vast majority of cases, be calling Canberra.
So who is the front door?
Local Land Services, or LLS, and the NSW planning agencies will still be your front door. You will still pick up the phone and deal with your local LLS office.
Okay.
However, behind that front door, those state agencies will be enforcing strict federal standards.
And this represents the death of the state-only safety net.
Completely.
In the past, you might check the state rules, see you had an exemption under the Local Land Services Act, and feel legally secure to fire up the bulldozer. But that is no longer enough.
No. The new question every land manager must ask isn't just, is this legal under state law? The question is, could this action significantly affect a matter of national environmental significance?
And this brings us to a massive shift in day-to-day operations, the tightening of land clearing exemptions. This is where the rubber really meets the road for agricultural expansion.
It is. Historically, if you were just managing regrowth on previously cleared land, you generally fell under a continuing use exemption. But the new federal guidance indicates that clearing vegetation older than 15 years is now highly risky.
Because regulators argue the elapsed time means the land use hasn't been continuous. Let's walk through a practical scenario here. Say you have a paddock you haven't touched in 16 years.
Okay.
The saplings have grown up, and you decide you want to clear that regrowth to put in a new crop. Under the old mindset, you might claim it is just routine maintenance of an existing agricultural area.
Right. But under the new EPBC standards, that argument falls apart. Even if the regrowth is less than 15 years old, to use the exemption, you must definitively prove that the clearing is strictly maintenance.
It cannot enlarge, expand, intensify, or change the location of the land use.
Exactly. The line between routine maintenance and agricultural expansion is being drawn much more sharply, which ushers in the era of self-assessment
The burden of proof has shifted.
entirely. It's now entirely onto you, the landholder. The federal regulator's expectation is that proponents must do their own documented self-assessment before taking action.
And how do you actually do that? It involves using federal digital tools like the Protected Matters Search Tool or PMST.
Yes. If you haven't seen this tool, it is essentially a digital mapping interface. You type in your property address, and it generates a report layering known habitats, threatened species, and ecological communities right over your property lines.
So you have to evaluate the significant impact guidelines against those layers and actually keep a written record of your reasoning.
Correct. If you decide not to refer a clearing action to the federal government, you need to have a concrete evidentiary basis proving why you believed it wouldn't impact a protected matter. It is no longer a matter of a farmer's judgment call.
It's a mandatory part of ordinary farm risk management.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting. Because these changes are not happening in a vacuum. There is a profound political and social tension surrounding this shift.
And remaining completely impartial here, just looking at the public statements, we see a massive divide.
We do. On one side, environmental groups are pushing hard for landscape-level changes. A prime example is the Wentworth Group of scientists.
Right. They have released a proposal called the Blueprint for a Healthy Country and Thriving Regions. It strongly advocates for bioregional landscape planning, regional ecological targets, and integrated environmental governance.
They want to look at conservation on a massive scale, mapping out corridors of native vegetation connecting across dozens of private properties, rather than just assessing impacts project by project.
But on the other side, you have the NSW Farmers Association fiercely pushing back against this exact model.
Yes, their representative, Bronwyn Patry, used some very strong language in a recent press release. She called this approach a land grab dressed up as conservation.
The primary concern from the farming sector is the erosion of private property rights. The argument is that this framework quietly sets up a pathway for government control of private land.
Shifting decision-making away from landholders who have generations of intimate, local experience and handing it over to what they call desktop experts.
In the capital cities, there is a deep-seated fear that the imposition of rigid national standards on nuanced local farming decisions could turn productive agricultural land into locked-up private reserves.
It is a profound clash of visions for the future of the landscape. But regardless of the pushback, the EPBC reforms are actively introducing this concept of bioregional planning.
And bioregional planning is a mechanism to approve actions at a landscape scale, theoretically reducing the need for individual project-by-project approvals.
Essentially, these plans will map out entire regions into specific zones. There will be development zones, essentially go zones, where priority actions can be undertaken without needing further federal assessment.
Because the offsets and environmental protections have already been pre-coordinated at a regional level.
Exactly. And conversely, there will be conservation zones, the no-go zones, where certain restricted actions will be strictly prohibited due to their high environmental value.
We are seeing pilots for these bioregional plans already popping up, particularly to facilitate renewable energy zones and urban development.
And the stated goal is certainty. If your property falls into a go zone, Your approval process is drastically streamlined.
But the tension lies in how those lines are drawn on the map, who gets to draw them, and what happens to the financial value of a family farm if it suddenly falls entirely within a no-go conservation zone.
If we connect this to the bigger picture and project forward to, say, 2032,
Mm.
we can see what a normal farm business will look like under this fully realized system.
Based on the structural changes happening right now, the farming operation of the 2030s will be heavily data-driven.
The EPBC reform package includes the creation of a new statutory entity called Environment Information Australia, or EIA. Their specific mandate is to provide high-quality, universally accessible environmental data.
We are talking about high-resolution satellite data, vegetation age layers updated in real time, and threatened species habitat tracking, all available on a public portal.
The days of arguing with a local inspector over the fence line about exactly how old a stand of trees is are over.
The satellite already has the answer, and that answer is public.
Environmental compliance will be based on objective, accessible data. Because of this, a normal, competent farm business will soon require a standing EPBC file.
And this won't just be a folder in a filing cabinet. It will be a dynamic, documented history of the property. It will include your mapped protected matter layers, satellite records of regrowth age, screening assessments downloaded from the PMST, and documented professional ecological advice for any borderline decisions.
It really paints a picture of farming fundamentally transitioning. It is no longer just about agricultural production. It is simultaneously about documented environmental management.
You will still deal with your local agencies, but you will be operating under a framework where every native vegetation decision, every fence line clearing, is filtered through a federal screening and proof process.
The time it takes to make a decision, the evidence required to back it up, and the transaction costs of getting professional advice are all going to increase.
To summarize what we have unpacked today, the 2025 EPBC reforms mark the definitive end of the informal state-only safety net for land clearing and development in New South Wales.
While you will still walk through the front door of local agencies like LLS, you will be doing so under the heavy, data-driven shadow of national environmental standards.
And the burden of proof to show that clearing is continuous use, or that it will not impact a matter of national significance, now sits squarely on your shoulders as the farm business.
The structural alignment between state and federal systems is inevitable, driven by a mutual desire to avoid duplication but enforce stricter net gain environmental outcomes.
And as we wrap up, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, something that builds on this massive shift towards data and transparency.
Consider this. As regional planning officially maps out go and no-go conservation zones across the landscape, and as organizations like Environment Information Australia make satellite data and federal compliance records essentially public knowledge.
We are entering an era of absolute environmental transparency.
Exactly. So as these national standards become the absolute baseline, how long until major domestic supermarkets or even international trade partners start demanding to see your farm's federal environmental compliance data before they will even agree to buy your crops or livestock?
Wow.
Could proving your compliance with the EPBC Act become the new minimum standard for simply entering the global agricultural supply chain?
That is a massive question for the future viability of agriculture, and it changes how we think about the value of a farm's data footprint. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the EPBC reforms. We hope this has helped clear the air on what is an incredibly complex but deeply important shift in how we manage the land. Until next time, keep asking the big questions.